Hi, I'm Ruth from pebble-collections.com. Do you suspect your spouse is struggling with mental health issues? How can you tell, and what's happening behind the symptoms you see? Before I begin, however, you need to have watched part 1 of Is Your Marriage Bleeding, as I will be expanding on some of the concepts I covered there. I'll also be referring to some of the ideas used in the clip How to Tell Past Traumas and Present PTSD Triggers. Most of us have heard of the black dog metaphor for depression. However, mental illness disorders of anxiety and depression can commonly coexist, and I like to call the anxiety-depression combination the grey-black dog. Whether it's anxiety as prominent leading to depressive or withdrawal episodes, or depression as primary with bouts of or together with anxiety. So how can you tell if there's something serious brewing deep beneath the surface with your spouse? One of the most helpful tools my psychologist used to help me understand mental health issues was the hand-brain concept by Dr. Dan Siegel. The shape of the hand closed in a fist of a certain way demonstrates the structure of the brain and helps to reveal its mannerisms. Here's a common image of the brain. There's the brain stem, the hindbrain, the cerebral cortex, and the forebrain. Working up from the arm, there's the spinal cord. The brainstem is at the wrist, and the lower palm is responsible for basic life functions such as breathing, heartbeat, and blood pressure. The lower back of the hand is the hindbrain. This region is associated with regulation and coordination of movement, posture, and balance. Passing up over the back of the hand and the fingers resides most of the senses. Functions such as movement, language, attention, and colour recognition. Which brings me to the two most relevant areas with anxiety depression, and these are the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. The limbic system is commonly known as the seat of emotion or the emotional brain that resides underneath the lateral surface regions of the brain. This system is represented by the thumb, tucked inside the hand against the palm, and the cerebral cortex, or the fingers, wraps over the top. The prefrontal cortex is represented by the fingertips, directly touching or connected to the emotional brain behind. So, why am I explaining this seemingly pointless fist to you? Remember from part 1 I mentioned such things like low memory retention, smoke alarms, personality changes, and protective bubbles? The explanations to what lie beneath these are better demonstrated with Dan's handbrain. Both depression and anxiety have similarities with their symptoms, making them appear the same, but they are two different beasts. Researchers found that they both share common areas of the brain, so I liken anxiety depression to two different mature trees that have grown close to each other and their branches overlap. There are three main systems to the emotional regulation of the brain: drive, threat, and soothing systems. It is not fully known where depression originates in the brain, but its negative effects are particularly evident within the drive system. Its purpose is to motivate us towards resources. Regarding anxiety, the amygdala is part of the threat system. Its purpose is threat detection and protection. As part of the limbic emotional system, it regulates adrenaline and the stress hormone cortisol. This is to promote feelings of anxiety, anger, or disgust. Anxiety requires the following: an environmental trigger that promotes stress. In response, adrenaline or noradrenaline is released into the bloodstream, resulting in anxiety. The release of the adrenaline is the brain's way of preparing the body for flight, fight, or freeze. This is in defense of a perceived threat or danger. This process is normal functioning of the body to protect itself. The amygdalae, because there are two of them, are the smoke alarms of the brain I spoke about in part 1. However, if the smoke alarms are not behaving as they should and the release is excessive, the hormone and neurotransmitter can build up in the body and brain, fueling further anxiety symptoms like panic attacks. Fear learning is also an element of the amygdala, contributing to the trigger component of PTSD. In response to trauma or trauma triggers, people react in unexpected or uncharacteristic ways, with a power that overrides logic. Regarding PTSD, understanding what's going on is made even more complex when it stems from multiple traumas, some spanning over a long period of time or era of life. The more traumas experienced by an individual, the greater the impact the resulting emotions will have in their life when they're triggered. Every reaction by a sufferer will be different to someone else's. Also, the reaction can sometimes be connected to a separate, hidden trauma that is totally unrelated to the trigger itself and the reaction. Research has found that those who have had a traumatic childhood and the resulting emotion from those traumas remains untreated and unresolved will have a 95% chance of developing a serious mental illness as an adult. So if you already know your spouse has grown up with trauma and lots of it, and has not sought professional assistance to determine if there is any hidden issues, it's more like when those traumas will take over rather than if they take over. As the emotional effects of past traumas do not get better over time on their own, like a chest cold, they compound and intensify, likening to the pressure of a volcano, until the force over many years is so great it will only take a minor, even unrelated trigger to blow its valve. Underneath the amygdala and directly linked to and connected is the hippocampus. Its major function is the formation of new memories or the conversion of short-term memory to long-term. The amygdala interacts with the hippo by attributing emotional components to the memories. If the amygdala is malfunctioning in the first place, it will also affect anything that interacts with it. In this case, memory retention. So anxiety and depression sufferers can have poor memory or be forgetful in nature. The amygdala is more than a smoke alarm, preparing the body to flight, fight or freeze. It's also a firewall of the brain and mind. A firewall of a computer monitors data traffic and decides whether to allow or block specific traffic based on a defined set of security rules. Everything that comes to the brain for processing goes through the firewall first, what is seen, heard, felt, from touch and so on. So the amygdala is allowing or blocking messages from getting through to what? Remember the fingertips? The amygdala within the emotional brain is directly connected to the prefrontal cortex, which is the foremost area of the brain behind the forehead. The PFC is part of the soothing system. Its purpose is to manage distress and promote bonding. It's commonly known as the seat of good judgment. The PFC is the logical central processing unit, the CPU of the computer, the brain. All the data from the body via the spinal cord, the brainstem, the senses, everything comes up and through the amygdala firewall and then passed on for processing. The PFC has a huge position description. Here we go. It controls attention, abstract thinking, behavior, problem-solving tasks, physical reactions, and the big one, personality. It is linked to a person's decision-making and planning, cognitive and social behavior. Most typically, it carries out executive functions such as the ability to differentiate among conflicting thoughts, determine good and bad, better and best, same and different, future consequences of current actions or activities, and social control. When a malfunctioning smoke alarm and firewall is connected to all of that, it's not hard to understand that multiple issues will inevitably occur. So I've covered low memory retention, smoke alarms, personality changes, and now protective bubbles. The bubble effect or survival mode I mentioned in part 1 is where the limbic system becomes so overwhelmed during an intense, stressful situation, the mind can disassociate or isolate itself from that moment to cope, manage, or protect. Going back to the hand brain, Dan describes it as an explosion of the limbic system that flips the lid. The regulator of the mind and brain is disconnected from the limbic system and control is lost. With the lid flipped, the PFC is no longer able to assess the perceived danger and ascertain if the reaction is logical or overkill. If the reaction is excessive, the PFC cannot tell the amygdala to calm down, it's just burnt toast. The smoke alarm doesn't receive the message of logic and good judgment, so it keeps pumping out the adrenaline in response to the perceived threat. An example of a flipped lid occurrence is with an emotional meltdown of an overstimulated child with autism. Someone under heavy anxiety or withdrawal and the lid has flipped can make inappropriate or uncharacteristic remarks, not only in private with you, the supporter, but others can be present too. And they will not generally perceive the negative impact or connotations of their words. For example, an inappropriate solution to solve a given logistical problem would be one that places you and or family members in harm's way. Remember, in this situation, there is no logical control of the emotional brain by the CPU. The hippo is also likely to be affected by the overactive amygdala, and therefore, as I explained in part 1, his memory of the episode would be twisted or non-existent. Also, did you notice while I was explaining the anger category during the PTSD clip, where I wrote the words "his eyes" on the legend list? While in a protected bubble or flipped lid state, the eyes may be unblinking and very intense. They could be looking directly to you, like a drilling rig boring a giant hole, but at the same time be lifeless, as if they're not looking at you, but through you. As if you weren't there and is really not seeing or hearing you. During this time, it is like arguing with an irrational child. While you're both debating a matter, he would be like a non-player character mentioned in the film Jumanji. They have a set of fixed or dogmatic responses or arguments. A good indication that this is happening and the lid has flipped would be if you found yourself thinking, I've already answered that argument, why are we going over that again? The chances of making any headway at this time would be extremely thin, as he'll have comebacks for everything you say. If, for example, he's tired of hearing implications of him being mentally sick, or if he feels there's nothing wrong, then anything said to him that relates to this, or him being emotionally out of control, may end up being perceived as a threat and be blocked from getting through to the CPU by the firewall. So, it's advisable to not talk about anything deep and meaningful, particularly his mental health struggles or disorders when he is low, withdrawn, or under it. Thank you for passing on this pebble to provide the chance for hope to touch a bleeding marriage. Until next time, onwards and upwards.